So last night I had this thought that so you know what, like when you're like slightly inebriated, by something, we'll say a substance, and you get deep in thought about like what you're doing, but what you're doing may be really simple, like it's a task like eating. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So last night I made myself two burgers, and they were super good. And I chose to do the thing because a lot of times I'll eat while like I'm watching something or I'm listening to something, but I decided not to, at least for some period of time. And I was just focused on, the experience of the of the burger.
Yeah.
Pretty powerful experience, number one. But number two, because I was just appreciating the burger, and I was thinking like how many, I wonder how long the total process was to put this burger together that had nothing to do with me like throwing meat on the grill and slapping buns on either side of
From like the creation of the universe to like the burger
it.
kind of thing.
No, no, I just mean in modern day, how many people had to contribute to this burger and how long did it take them to put the parts together for me to be able to just go to the store, pick it up, and cook it, you know?
But you didn't go one step beyond that and think like, oh, the cow's eating this grass. This grass is only for this.
I think that would have been too much for me to handle, to
Yeah.
be honest. Because I started that book, Sapiens.
Oh yeah, great
Read it?
book. Yeah.
Yeah, been super super interesting so far. And for anyone listening, I think it would be a good recommendation and a good read. But that's something that he has talked about so far, is just sort of cumulative culture and the cumulative effect of other people's efforts and how much more reliant we are on other people than we actually think. Like we think we're all these little individual entities, but in reality, it's like being able to wear a piece of clothing is like one of the most complicated processes that involves all these different things on the map. And of course, when I'm reading this book and I'm thinking about all these things, I don't really have to try, it kind of just happens, like the sort of relay to the training realm and the biomechanics realm and all that stuff. And there are some interesting analogies to be made about like the body in that specific case. But the part of the reason I was thinking about this in relationship to today's topic, which is I think is very broadly just personal training, is just like there are so many inputs that we have in personal training. Like there's the biomechanics side, there's like what exercise do you pick, there's the client psychology piece, who are you dealing with, what is their availability, how do your personalities interact, how often are you seeing them, how long per session are you seeing them. There's so many different inputs that like it can get really really complicated to try to cover everything at once. So rather than doing that, I think we should just start from maybe a point of like programming discussion, because programming as a very broad topic is something that a lot of people ask about a lot, especially when it comes to coaching clients, which for some reason to me never really made sense until we met Tom. And then Tom was able to kind of articulate to us the idea that like, the workout is composed of like these things we call sets, and the sets are composed of the reps, and the reps are composed of the mechanics. So like, let's start with the mechanics and then work our way sort of more broadly from there. So programming for clients, to be honest, is not something that I have personally like sat down to write about or think much about, because when I started training people, it was kind of just like I have a broad outline of something in my head of what we're going to do, but we're kind of just going to see what happens, see what this person likes and don't like, and do some sort of appraisal of like where they're at, and then we're just going to like take a best guess. And I think people are very generally uncomfortable with the idea that like you are just taking a guess and you are just taking your most educated, quote unquote, shot at like what might work for this person. But in reality, to me, it's like a very messy thing. So when I ask you something like or someone just in the gym or just on the street comes up to you and they're like, yo, you a personal trainer, how do you program for your clients? Because that is the question, right? It's like, how do you program for your clients, as if there's like I can write it out in a couple of sentences. So I'm interested to see kind of where your brain goes with that line of thinking.
I get that question a lot. It's not probably like top 10 question. Number one is, how long you've been lifting for,
what do you bench,
how much you bench,
yeah,
um, will you train me? It's pretty common. Something
yeah,
like it's not uncommon for like a homeless person to ask me that, which is always a little bit awkward. Just like, yeah, bro, take down my number.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but yeah, how do I program for clients? Man, that is definitely a black box, kind of thing. Because, you know, much like you, from the standpoint of, it just being so individual over the years, I've moved from the idea that like I could create some sort of standardized template to like, yeah, this is probably just never going to happen.
mm-hmm.
I mean, I think in theory, if you were at a place that where all the trainers are under like one system, and there's someone who's kind of like at the top of that hierarchy, or like a Mike Boyles or something, it makes a lot of sense to have a standardized system,
Mm-hmm.
even if for nothing else than just like the flow of the gym. I think personal training is largely based on just like logistics and constraints. Like usually it's kind of like how I look at a diner menu, where it's often like, what do I not want? Like, what am I
Yeah,
trying to avoid here? And then we kind of narrow it down to like, okay, this is what's left over. And a lot of problem solving seems to get done that way, where it's like looking for the right answer a lot of times starts with what can't you do? And you almost never get a person where there's not a limitation. And if they think they don't have a limitation, it's almost like your job is to kind of figure out what that is. Especially when I get people for bodybuilding consults. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I will often ask them like, what's your failure point? Like, where do the wheels fall off? What happens? Like, what breaks on you? And it gives me a good idea of just like, how far they've pushed things, because, ultimately it's very likely that the wheels will fall off somewhere if you've pushed really hard. And then, two, it just kind of sets the basis for like how I'm going to design things going forward. Because a lot of it is just, survivability. If you're going to do, something like trying to build muscle, it's, a really long-term process. So it's going to be a lot of it's going to be like mitigating downsides versus trying to do it, as fast as you can possibly do it. Also, it's very difficult to measure things in this realm, right? Like we can measure performance, but it's very difficult to know, even in a very long, training block. Like I think it's very popular for people to do like, 4-week training blocks. Mine tend to be a lot longer, but even in like a 16-week training block, you don't really know, like, was this the most effective thing for my biceps? Like what measure are you going to use for that? Circumference is not going to be accurate, reliable enough, and in a small enough, it's not going to be able to measure like the smallest change that you can make in that instance. So you really don't have a great tool to assess like, did this thing work better than the other thing? A lot of it ends up just being like, well, we know that didn't work, so we just kind of move away from it.
yeah. I think that, and this is somewhat of a tangent, the point about the individual exercise thing, but that's I think a big problem with just the framing of a lot of these things, where we'll say that an exercise is like muscle building. Like this is a muscle, this is a muscle building. This is the best exercise for this muscle group. And the assumption behind that question is that you have a precise enough calculator to be able to make that determination somehow. And so in some ways it's like, I understand the point of, more than anyone, social media and being a little bit hyperbolic about things. But it really, I think, puts people in the wrong direction. And when it comes to actually like thinking about these things, when people are trapped in that framework of, uh, this exercise is better because this exercise will give you better results. And it's like, it's just a very reductionistic way to look at like what the end result is. And even in the case of observing an end result, thinking that you're going to be able to make that specific of a claim about something that is existing within this massive pool of inputs that you're giving yourself over time. One of the things in relationship to the programming thing, though, that I was interested in relationship to you, and you kind of touched on it, was not necessarily just where you are now with things, but sort of how you got there, because I think that's where like a lot of the interesting bits lie, is like, what kinds of things were you seeing, like, just to be more concrete about it with one example, like something we've talked about more recently is how your approach to, or your philosophy on like reps have changed in relationship to clients. Like I know with some clients, you'll say, hey, this is the number that I want you to do, and with others you're just like, you're going to let the person who you're working with do however many they want, whereas another person, you're maybe sort of as they're doing the exercise, you're going to be like, oh, one more, and randomly just determine two more or whatever. So I used to, I think on paper, want to be the person to just write down the number and tell the person the number, until I realized a number of different things. But I'm interested in your case, like why that transition maybe happened, and like what specifically you were seeing, or what feedback you were getting that sort of pushed you in that direction as opposed to the opposite.
Yeah, I think one of the concepts we keep coming back to, and it was specifically relevant when we were talking about like training short versus lengthen. And I was just saying like, oh, everyone's kind of on this like lengthen bandwagon right now. But as we become more mature with this conversation, like most things, I think it'll end up somewhere in the middle. And the progression for me programming wise is like, when something comes along that's, new and interesting, earlier in my career, or when I have a particular way of doing things and I think, oh, this could apply, to just about everyone, you just find over time that's almost never the case. And I've been very surprised to just see, like, when I look at all my clients' programs, how different they actually are. Like, they are so different. And early on, it was very much trying to create like a generalized template and then kind of, migrate from there. And of course, every time you start with a new person, which is, relatively rare for me these days, you do kind of rework that template again. You get better and better at having conversations and kind of pulling information out of people. But there's still, going to be some sort of generalized way you do things the first time around. And I find that, I get so few like new people these days that by the time I do work with someone new, my framework has changed again. So it's like trying to create a template for that's been kind of pointless. But to your point, on reps and how that, applies to all this, my first point was just that, like, man, is it literally different between every single client based on, number one, like what their goals are, two, again, what their limiters are. Like, more than anything else, it's just like, what am I trying to avoid here? Like, is the thing that I'm trying to teach the person, how to execute better reps so that they don't get hurt? Is the thing that I'm trying to teach the person, like, how to push closer to failure? Is the thing that the person wants just sort of like a subjective experience, and they're very happy with where they are, they just want to maintain that, and the focus maybe lies elsewhere, maybe somewhere in like the sports leisure realm. So it can range from anything to like, this person probably has, 5 to 10 reps easily, in reserve on a given set. Which, I guess if you went on social media, I'm imagining people would be like, well, why would you ever do that? Like, what's the point of that? And it's like, well, not everyone is in a position to make progress. Like, there's really not, in my opinion, like a point to just say, all right, we're always going to put the foot on the gas pedal, regardless of what the person's goals or, circumstances are. And if you just say like, well, training along muscle lengths is better, or, if you're not training reasonably close to failure, you're not doing anything. And it's just absolutely not true. So there's absolutely a demographic who, can do really good reps and kind of maintain roughly where they are, have a body that feels good and performs good. and doesn't, necessarily need, to push the envelope, like on that particular vector in regards to like, hypertrophy stimulus. It's like, no, just kind of maintain the amount of muscle you have now, which doesn't, you could do very few sets, that are a little bit harder, or you could do a little bit more sets, and maintain as well. So sometimes the constraint could be like, how often and for how long, do I see this person? And then you're just kind of spreading out the stimulus. You may find sometimes that like, yeah, even though we're resistance training, the thing this person really needs is more like, cardiovascular fitness. So they don't want to get on, the treadmill, elliptical, what have you, when we're there together, but we can find creative ways where, yeah, maybe it takes away from the hypertrophy stimulus, but if that's not what they need, or that's not what they're prepared to adapt to, then, we'll sort of direct the, the focus somewhere else. So some just specific examples of, how I might do, a rep scheme for people, or, how that rep scheme might apply in terms of like proximity to failure or progression. Probably the most like recognizable model that you'll see with me is like a double progression, where, I'll pick a rep range. That rep range might change, block to block, but it could be something like 12 to 15 reps at a given load. And, I'll literally just add a rep to that entire, grouping of sets, right? If they're doing like 3 sets of 12, the next week it might actually just be 13, 12, 12. And then, it doesn't have to be the next week, but the next workout, right? And then the following one could be 13, 13, 12. And yeah, it takes a while to get, from 3 sets of 12 to 3 sets of 15. But again, the first thing you start with is like, who is this person? Where are they at? How much progress can they make? Because when you play that out over the course of the year, when I get back up to 15 reps, even if I just, add a few percent to that, say add 5 pounds to whatever they're doing, in another, 10 weeks or whatever it is, they've added 5 pounds to where they were before that. And that's a pretty big freaking difference for someone who's been training for a decade plus. So the early weeks might be relatively easy. If you were doing 100 pounds for 3 sets of 12 and you get up to 3 sets of 15, with 100, and you're basically like, pushing failure on every set. And then you drop back down to 12 and you're doing 3 sets of 12 with 105. That'd be pretty easy, for a while. You'll get a little bit of recovery, but gradually over time, you'll just get, closer and closer to failure. We'll reset. And that's a relatively, simple way to do things for people who really don't want to be extremely mindful and internally focused, and just a lot of people just want to be told what to do. If you ask certain people like, oh, would you like to do something different? Or is there anything that like you want to work on? Or do you have any specific goals? Or how do you like this exercise? How do you like this rep range? Like they don't want to talk about it. They just want to be told what to do. For people who don't want to think and just walk in, rinse and repeat, I think that can be a pretty good scheme, and for plenty of other people as well. Very much like on the opposite side of things in terms of like the amount of autonomy that they have is I will pick a weight that I think a person can get for, whatever the set amount of reps I'm looking for is. Let's take the same scheme where I'm like, all right, I'm still going to use, let's say a double progression through, 3 sets from 12 escalating up to 15. And I'll pick a weight I think they can do for 12. It might work very similar where maybe when they get up to 15 reps, maybe I add 10% or so to the load, and, then they just, execute the set. But the difference is I'm not telling them to do a given number of reps. I might actually just have them, you could theoretically set, a number of reps in reserve. But for the person that I really want to be focused on doing each individual rep perfectly, I may tell them just, take this to failure, but don't count the reps, and that can vary as well. Sometimes I'll have people not count at all. Sometimes I will have them count, just depending on like how close they're getting to failure, how close I want them to get to failure, and like, do I start to see them take on a sort of psychological approach to failure that I either like, or don't like. And I'll expand on that further. But when we talk about failure in the research, it seems like this very like cut and dry thing where it's just like, okay, yeah, when the bar stops moving, you've reached failure. You're done. Like, obviously, nothing else could have happened. But in the real world, you see how many influences there are on that perception of failure. Like, very often, if I just count while someone is doing something, and kind of pull them out of their head, pull them out of the sensations that they're feeling. And I just keep a rhythm to it. 1, 2, 3, something where they just have like a metronome. The reps go up, tremendously. It's pretty amazing. I'll do that with a person who I see become very kind of heady with the reps, where you can tell like, oh, they're moving just fine. And then it starts to burn and they're like looking for failure. So like I explained, sometimes, I'll let someone just focus on the reps, not necessarily count, not have a goal number of reps. And I think that allows people to, execute each individual rep very well when they're not thinking about, oh, I have to go to 15. They're just thinking, do each rep as perfectly as I can do this rep. And wherever the end is, but I don't control that. I just do every rep perfectly and I let the end be where the end is, which is exactly how I train myself. I do see, however, with that approach, that many people start to kind of find the end sooner than it needs to be. They start to, a lot of times they'll kind of like pause and let go of a little bit of tension in like a lengthened position. And then they'll go to like do that next rep and just get stuck. So then sometimes you have to pull them back into either, counting out loud, or tell them, okay, this set, we're going to do this many reps, or just find some way to take them out of their head or out of this rhythm where they're just like getting stuck. They're moving smoothly. And then all of a sudden, like they just get buried in the lengthened position. And then you kind of know, like from a biomechanics standpoint, all right, I know the resistance profile of this machine. I can see the velocity that they're moving at. There's no way this person should just be getting pinned and just kind of, at the end, right? When I see that, like, it's kind of a red flag for me. So with some people, I'll kind of alternate between like, all right, let's work on just making each rep as perfect as possible. And then if I see them start to like, find failure, create failure, another way this happens is just where an exercise doesn't, either has a really poor resistance profile or has really poor anchoring. Yesterday, for example, I was having someone do, dumbbell curls with their arm supported. And it was an example where it was like, yeah, you did 10 reps smooth and then on the 11th rep, you just died. So what I had him do was like lean back against a preacher bench, and the preacher's kind of like at a slant. He's kind of almost laying back against it. And that just made the resistance profile a bit heavier in the lengthened position, like a typical preacher curl would be. And he went from like 10 reps to 15, 16 reps just with that change. And then the last 3 were all slow versus like, 10 reps at exactly the same speed and then just a 0 rep. So when we talk about failure, it's like, yeah, he couldn't have done another rep on that first dumbbell curl, but a lot of that was just the setup. And sometimes it'll be the setup, sometimes it'll be the person's ability to, generate that internal or, external anchoring. Sometimes it'll be the psychological anchoring that you give a person going into a set. What I mean by that is just like how you preface it, how you frame it in your mind, like what's going on, in your head as you're doing the set. Are you thinking about how uncomfortable you are? Are you aiming for a rep target? All of that, has a tremendous influence on the appearance of failure at the end of the day.
Yeah, there's so much there. Ooh, nice Starbucks. See, I do my coffee homemade, like although it is ours, it's actually Starbucks, just the ground. Now that I'm thinking about it. Anyway, Yeah, the anchoring stuff is really a huge thing when it comes to that. More so I see with people that are, we'll say, more generally trained. Like with personal training clients, I find that, I guess it obviously depends on the person, but just broad scopes. Like I generally speaking see the people that are really into hypertrophy messing up with the physical anchoring a lot more than the psychological anchoring. But that is definitely something that I hadn't really thought about before we had discussed it however many months ago, just in terms of the framing of the set and the approach to the set. But I think that another thing too, just on the anchoring thing, because I was thinking about this a little bit last night. I actually wrote something on my whiteboard. I wrote constant force against anchors force you to control eccentric motion. And what I have noticed with that is I think people get really good at the anchoring on the shove. So like on the initial, like if it's in the curl example, they're pretty good at the initiation a lot of the times because it's just a very direct thing to push into. But then when people go to initiate an eccentric, by definition that they've lost control of the weight. If they lose any pressure away from the actual external implement. So like a chest support is a good example of this, where you can feel the difference immediately when on the eccentric you pay a special amount of attention to keeping pressure on the chest pad as opposed to just letting the weight go forward. And it's a very weird sensation because it's almost like your smush into whatever you're smushing into is controlling the motion in a weird way. And it kind of feels like your body is this like thing that's sort of surrounding that loading. But anyway, one of the things that you had mentioned along that storyline there was you mentioned like different archetypes of clients in relationship to how you go about approaching like the framing portion of like how you prescribe reps. And I'm really interested in like how, like what the kinds of signals are that you are paying attention to make those decisions, because that to me is the next layer of like, well, okay, this makes sense. Now we've kind of established this generalized framework in that we're not able to standardize something across every single client. That's like broad scopes. Layer number one is like we can't just have this cookie cutter thing, especially if you have very, very different types of clients, which I would say in some ways you have some very different clients, like almost more than anyone else. And then the second layer is like, okay, now we're like moving toward the reps, or we'll call it the sets. Sets. I feel like number of sets is something that I have never especially. I feel like number of sets in a session really just comes down to the time constraint of how often and how long you're seeing that person every single week. Because if you're seeing them for an hour twice a week, it's kind of like, in some ways, it's kind of there's somewhat of a layout that is already embedded in that framework, where it's like, all right, we're not going to do 15 or 20 sets of biceps probably, unless that's all this person wants to do. Like we're probably going to split volume somewhat evenly across that amount of time that we have. But again, what I'm interested in relationship to the next layer of that is like, what kinds of signals or inputs from the client are you paying attention to, insofar as how you decide to prescribe them zero, like you're not prescribing them reps, you're telling them, hey, we're just going to take this one at a time, versus the person that wants to see the 15 on paper and they want to hit that 15 number.
I mean, I think the first thing is always like, what's the goal of the person? And the majority of people that I train, especially in person, have a stated goal of looking better, but they're not always in a position where that's going to be anything other than maintenance, right? So it's like looking better could be losing body fat, and I think that's where a lot of like gen pop people come in, is they don't even really understand the concept of like body composition. Is your muscle mass relative to your body fat? They usually just come in and think like, I would look better if I had less body fat, which really isn't so much a function of what we do, but much more of like what's happening in the kitchen. But of course, like if you put muscle on someone, that's going to change, the relative sort of ratio of fat to muscle, and theoretically, like, also give you a little boost in terms of just your resting energy expenditure. But
And
with
just
yeah,
on that point, you said the word position, like, a client may not be in a particularly good position. Can you talk more about what you mean by position in terms of, do you mean like behaviorally?
yeah, it's just like there's only so much muscle a person is going to grow if they're 65 years old, they've been training for 15 years, and they sort of just eat in a like ad libitum sort of way. They just eat what they want when they want. And that may be where someone wants to be in life, where it's just like they enjoy having some wine and going out to eat, and they're not interested in tracking food, and all around they're healthy and look pretty good. You can stress both of you yourselves out. You can stress both of you and the client out by like constantly trying to like change things up, and like pretend like this next new thing is going to change everything. And for some people, like, there probably is a demographic where that's super relevant, and it may just be that like there's a certain type of person that I attract. But at a point in personal training, it's like maintenance is actually where you are. And if you can improve a little bit year over year, and you have someone that's much older, like maybe half of my clients, that's amazing. Like, even if you're just maintaining after 15 plus years of training and you're in your 60s, you look good, feel good, that's pretty amazing. But a lot of people listening to this podcast probably are not working with people at that age, or probably not that age themselves. So you kind of move away from that demographic a little bit, and much more if I'm like working with people for consultations, and then like a few people in person. I'm like, all right, this person is actually like in a position where nutritionally they have a plan, whether that plan be to lose fat, gain muscle. Like, there's something that is being measured, or at least managed in some way nutritionally. um we're tracking something, whether it be like body weight, calipers, even the like conscious effort to change performance and understand kind of like where the person is going. So we're actually having conversations of like, this is the goal, this is where we're trying to get to, versus it just kind of being like a background static thing. But let's say the person is in a position where they can build muscle, they have nutrition's on point, like we are actually having regular conversations and taking regular measurements. Then your next question from there, I believe, is now how do we decide like how to set up this person's set and rep scheme? Is that right?
Yeah. And you can tell me if you think this is too tangential, but I also am interested in this idea of because kind of what you're getting at is like, and this is most things with client relationships, and even ourselves to a large degree, is you're kind of just taking like I said earlier, a best guess, and observing what you think is in alignment with a desired goal. And if you are moving toward that goal, then you keep doing that thing. And if you are not moving toward that goal based on your, again, best guess, then that's something that you need to change. And one of the things that has come up multiple times here, and is a big talking point, especially in trainers that I have talked to, just through social media and in person, is there's this assumption that like the client needs to improve their performance every week from a loading standpoint, or a set standpoint, or a proximity to failure standpoint. In any metric, the client needs to improve in terms of quantity, in order to get closer to the goal of weight loss or muscle building and whatever. But I've just seen in so many cases people's body composition improve dramatically with no improvement in like what you would call objective performance. Like maybe, on the chest supported row, they're lifting, the 150 for 10 to 15 reps. And it's like 8 weeks later, maybe they're at 155 for similar reps, or maybe they're, on that particular day, they're doing 140, but the reps look great. Like I personally over time have become less and less attached to putting more weight onto the machine or the bar or the implement for, what we call Gen Pop clientele. And I think that even in from a bodybuilding perspective, the reason that tracking your metrics is important has less to do with making sure that you're going up, and more, I think it's more important from the perspective of what it says maybe indirectly about the way that you're doing the exercise, or, if it's a new exercise, how quickly you're learning that exercise, or just over time. Like if you are only seeing that number go backward, maybe that to me would be a red flag. But what do you think about that as a general thought process that kind of gets layered on top of this, of like not necessarily trying to push the needle? And obviously, to some degree, it's like certain clients that I have had are really attached to asking me like, oh, what did we do last week, or what did we do last session, and what did we do this session, and how much more is it, or is it less, or is it the same? And people psychologically, even clients who have studied none of this stuff, are super into like seeing the incremental gains. So like there were times where admittedly, I won't name names, but like clients were like doing well based on what I thought were their goals. And, I've had this person who was losing weight for this amount of weeks. He looks totally different. His confidence level just walking around the gym is totally noticeably different. Like all those things that I thought were going to be the goals for this person were going in the right direction. But the weight that they were lifting, like on XYZ exercise, wasn't improving. And I know that there's someone that, wants to see that improve. I'll just like lie. I'll be like, last week you did 50 and this week you did 55, where maybe it was like last week they did 50 and this week they did 50 again. I never really got in the habit of that. That wasn't like a frequent thing that I did. But yeah, just thoughts on that in general, in terms of the progression, both for clients that, you're training that are in their 60s or their 40s or whatever, your client base, but then also for you personally. Because I know that for you has also been a little bit of a change relatively recently in terms of your whole training career.
My experience for the most part is that when a person wants those numbers to move, outside of someone who's like, natural and like really advanced, which it's not really like the demographic that I see on a daily basis, kind of like the 3DMJ crowd or something like that. I imagine, that's a thing where you just have like a, highly neurotic, like natural athlete who's been training for 20 years. And, their goal is to like put a quarter a pound of muscle on in a year and like, 1 pound on their bench press. That, isn't like typically the demographic I see. Like I'll see, anything like you mentioned from like the 65-year-old guy who's been recreationally training for 15 plus years to like the enhanced person who's like our age and looking to compete. But my experience is that like when people are actively trying to make progress, so the mindset is like we have a goal, we have a program, and they're aware of that program, I pretty much always see the numbers move. And even sometimes it's all it takes is just deciding like, oh, now we're doing something. Like it could be like, oh, now I'm dieting. And then the numbers just start going up. And I see that even with the type of programming I was describing before, where I just say, do as many reps, as many good reps as you can until, the bar just stops moving. And, they're going to be pretty unemotional, just perfectly executed reps. Like, you're still going to grind. It's still going to be hard. You're still going to make some faces as you do it. But like, just that mindset of, oh, now we're in a dieting phase. Now we're in, a weight gaining phase. Like now we're getting ready for this thing, or we write a new program. Like just the mental switch of we're doing something, we're going somewhere. moves that needle, more than you'd think. In my own programming, it was more so in the past where I would have sort of like an estimated rate of progression, where it's like, again, I'm going to try to add a rep a week. I'm going to try to add, a couple pounds, a week or a session. And I would always see that move, over the course of a block. And now it's much more like I described a moment ago, which is that I just do perfect reps until, I can't do anymore. I write that amount of reps that I got for the day on, the bottom of the note or on a separate note so that I can't see it. So I walk into the gym, it's like, do my warm-up set. I'm going to put 200 pounds on this machine or whatever. And I'm just going to do, 3 sets, as perfect as I can, to failure. And when I look back every single week, it's almost always more. It really is like never less along, entire like 16-week or so block. But what happens to me over time is like, as we educate ourselves more, as, I get new equipment, I train at different gyms, as we change the way, you execute given exercise, like we talked about, just adding things like, anchors. Because I'm always, trying to learn more and do things better. I wasn't like, doing a flat bench press, 20 years ago, and I'm still doing, the flat bench press in the same way. So I can't look back and say, all right, when I was, X body weight, I was doing flat bench press at this weight for this many reps, and now I'm doing the same thing. Like every year I evolve, and every year the way, I do exercises evolve. So for me, that's been enough novelty where like I clearly get stronger over the course of the year using those exercises. And that progression, for me at where I'm at in my career never really stops. It's like I add a little bit, each week. I may, during like a bridge or kind of a deloading period, either step away from that exercise or, do it a little bit easier, do it in a different way usually. And then, yeah, maybe when I come back to it, I reset a little bit lower, but over the course of, 3, 4, 5-month period, like I pretty much see whether I'm purposely setting a progression model or whether I'm just doing the best reps I can, within a given set. I do see performance, tend to go up over that time period.
Yeah, I guess, my general frustration with the conversation around, using more weight over time is there seems to be this conflation of progressive overload with muscle building. And like progressive overload as a concept is like has kind of become like a smoke bomb term to use to basically make that comparison of, if you're adding more weight week to week, then you're making progress. When in reality, it's like, I don't know. You can definitely look much better over the course of X amount of weeks, and get weaker or, be the same degree of strength. And, much like all of these other very generalized concepts, I just think that it really ties people into thinking one way, and what it does to their clients, I think, as a consequence of that, is something that works against both the trainer and the client, which is like, well, if you set the expectation for your client to begin with, who maybe didn't have expectations that like they should be adding weight because progressive overload is important, and then all of a sudden, week 2, week 3, they're not adding weight for whatever reason, which maybe, is a separate issue on its own, like if that weren't actually happening. But you create this whole degree of confusion for the client that maybe wouldn't have been there otherwise, or this whole like psychological stress component of like, well, my trainer wants me to be adding weight every single week, and therefore if I don't add weight, or if I don't do this many reps, or if I don't add reps every week, then I'm not only am I disappointing my trainer, but I'm letting myself down. I'm not making the progress that I should be making. So just overall, I guess this comes back full circle to the conversation just around like, who are you dealing with? Because some people are already in that place and they're already tied to that notion. And you need to maybe sort of peel back the layers to get them to ask themselves a little bit more precise of a question. Like, why is that the assumption to begin with? But I just found that overall letting go of that expectation for me personally has been helpful, because it lets me, I don't know, it's freeing in a way, but it also allows the client to actually focus on things that I think are more important, like, the individual rep, rather than just where are we headed 10 weeks from now, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think if you have a client that has that type personality, then it's your responsibility as a trainer to set up the constraints such that they do see that, which is particularly difficult to do. You just have to start, relatively easy, and you have to make a slow progression.
Yeah.
So it just comes down to like, how long of a training block are you setting up? What's the rate of progression that you're building in? And that's what I mean in terms of, it can be so individual, and you just start with the goal and where the person's at, because it's easy to create a model where the person is always, doing more. If the model is we're going to do every set to failure, and the client's going to expect, to put weight on the bar, every week, for some clients, that'll be just fine. For me, that's just fine. Other people, that's again based on where they're at. Like some of the guys I described earlier, that might not happen for. But that first double progression model, I explained, if you are doing 3 sets of 15 with 100, and I go to 3 sets of 12 at 105, like I know you can do that. And I know you're going to be fine for a long time. So I don't think it's too difficult to set up a model where someone's kind of guaranteed, to see things go up over time, like if that's what's really important to them. And I get the sense from listening to some other podcasts and stuff that part of the confusion with progressive overload is like the load part of it. And people, when they hear load, they think, weight, whereas load from like a physiological sense doesn't necessarily mean weight. It's like a stress load, like it's a magnitude. So there's so many other ways to, progress a stress. But at the same time, like I do think most people like can just add weight. Like probably the majority of people listening, like can still just do a little bit better than they did last week. Like there's not that many people that, again, if someone's goal actually is maintenance, or, maybe they just want to like lose some body fat or whatever, like there's lots of situations where, what? No, it's not smoking. We're cooking bacon.
Nice. Is it applewood smoked?
Is it applewood smoked?
Yes.
Yes.
Nice.
What else?
Fucking nailed it. Yeah.
That's a beautiful fall. Like I just want the aroma of bacon in this somewhat like upstate New York fall conditions we're in here.
I love fall.
The best. So yeah, like in terms of whether or not someone's going to be adding load, I could see it also getting like swung too far in the other direction, where a lot of people hear like there's so many different ways to progress your training without progressing load, which is like definitely true, but most people aren't smart enough to do that. So I wonder if they just end up doing less. Like for us, yeah, every time we learn something, it's like, oh yeah, adding this like seatbelt to this machine allows us to get, more reps, or moving from, this profile to that profile, or, adding a wrist strap or whatever. Like there's so many different things that change the constraints of how we train. And we might be looking at very nuanced variables like, tempo and what exercises came before it. But I think a lot of that just kind of comes naturally when you're forced to do that. Yes, it's a psychological hit, I guess, when you can no longer add load. But maybe that's what you need to go pursue, other means of progressing. Like, I'm not too worried about, like, when it comes to people that are like doing their own programming, like people listening to this podcast, like, that's probably what you need, is to run into a problem. You're like, okay, I do these barbell and dumbbell exercises, and maybe they're not like quote unquote optimal or whatever, but now your shoulder hurts. And you're like, okay, so now I move on to this next solution. And I can't add weight to the bar, so I find this other way to do it. And I'm not saying you couldn't become more nuanced more quickly, and that it wouldn't, that it would be worse to become nuanced more quickly. I don't think that at all. But I do think like the majority of people like still have the ability to slowly just progress with, load and or reps, and they may be underselling themselves by taking on the mentality, of someone who's trying to maintain. Because for the most part, like, whether it be the last, like, 15 plus years that I train natural, or whether it be, almost every training partner that I ever had being natural, like, everyone progresses when we train together. Like, that's just what I see. Like, whether we're doing 200 sets or 80 sets, like, people get better every week. Like, when you're in the right environment, like, I'm just not seeing a lot of this just like, oh, under no circumstance, does anything budge. It might be, slower than you expect it to be. Like, I think sometimes people just set up crap models where it's like, all right, this is a 4-week training block, and we're going to go from like, 20 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour. It's like, well, by week 4, like, everyone I've ever trained with is like just learning how to do shit. Like, you're like figuring it out. So I don't know. I think you can set up a lot of bad models that make it look like there's nowhere to go. But I do think it's possible to create a model that maybe starts easy enough, ends hard enough, or, introduces new variables where you always have some semblance of improving something.
Yeah, and I also think that to that general point of it being not that difficult to progress, I find that when people aren't progressing, what a lot of times ends up being the case is that they're taking an absolute load approach to an exercise that should be, as all exercises should be, like on a relative load basis. So for the listener, what that means is, like, if you are doing a bench press, what you're probably used to is like adding 5 pounds on either side, because maybe you're benching 200 pounds for 10 to 15 reps or something. But then you go over to the dumbbell lateral raise and you're lifting 15-pound dumbbells, and you think that grabbing the 20s is a good idea, without realizing that it's like a 30% load increase as compared to, whatever percentage of the bench press it was, a much smaller percentage.
Happened to me in the gym a few weeks ago. Someone came up to me and they were like, tips to improve, my shoulders. Like, I just can't progress anymore. And, you're looking at the person, you're listening to them, and you're kind of starting to like, get some preconceived notions about like where this person's coming from. And they're, I'm like, well, are we talking about a specific exercise here? Like, because again, it's very difficult to identify like, oh, I'm not building muscle in my shoulders. Like, everything else, is growing, but like,
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Like, I gained a millimeter, everywhere else, but like, I ultrasound, my middle delt, and it's like, just not growing. People usually mean, something like, have a very specific thing in mind that's not improving, and they ask a different question. So you do want to get at like, what are you actually asking?
Yeah, give me an example.
So yeah, so this was the example. Like, someone came up to me in the gym the other day.
Okay, yeah.
I just can't build my shoulders. What they really meant was my lateral raise weight isn't going up.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the person. I go, well, how much weight do you lateral raise, right? And it was like, 40 pounds, or whatever for a 10, right? And this person's probably like $145 or something like that.
Okay. So right away you have a lot of information.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're just like playing investigator here, right? Like, we're just kind of like, as Stu would say, just like playing jazz, bottom of this thing. We're just like, you're dancing around. So then it's like, you just learn the right questions to ask over time. It's like, well, where were you, a few months ago? How much weight were you using then? And it was like, and I don't remember, it was like 20 pounds, to 40, I was doing 20 pounds 3 months ago, and now I'm doing 40 pounds, and I can't progress anymore. And I was like, well, it's because your form sucks. And like, I hadn't even seen the person lift, right? Like, you already know, like, there's no way you went from 20 pounds to 40 pounds, on lateral raises over a few months. The reason you can't progress is because you just ran out of runway using like whatever shitty technique you employed to make that progress. And then there could be a lot of ways to solve that. Like the easiest way, because I was just speaking to this person, like, just outside of the locker room, was, just basically describe to him, like, look, number one, what you explained a minute ago, that the jump from, 20 to 25 pounds, is a 25% increase. That's a massive, massive increase, let alone, doubling the load. So instead of trying to progress the load every time, maybe just, add a rep here or there, if you can, micro load it, you could do it with like a 1 pound too. But even then, 1 pound, over 20 pounds, still 5% can be a pretty big increase too. So one, you can find creative ways to slowly add load, but most importantly for this person, like, let's lighten the load, let's improve the technique. And for someone who's a little bit more advanced, who didn't have such a, just like a glaring issue with their progression model, it might be moving from, the dumbbell lateral raise to a cable lateral raise. Again, where, yeah, you can make some small incremental changes in load, but also, you can have a better resistance profile. You can create some good, anchors to push against. And all of a sudden now, like I was describing earlier with that dumbbell curl, the things that go from like the same speed at 10 reps to just 0 speed at 11 reps are very hard to progress. The things that you can just grind out every inch, you're able to, micro load reps or load, because you're not hitting this point that's exponentially harder than the rest of the rep. Mm-hmm. So just picking the right exercise a lot of times is what allows you to progress. So I don't think the only issue with the dumbbell lateral raise is that people use light weights. I think a major thing that makes it difficult to progress is like the resistance profile, the anchoring, like that sort of stuff, right? So that's another major variable in like why someone thinks they can't progress. And again, my opinion is like most of the time you can find a way to progress. And, as you get more and more advanced, maybe it becomes more nuanced. But most of the time it's pretty glaring. Like I think most of the people are like that kid who came up to me, where it's just like, yeah, you didn't progress because you went up, 200, you went up 100%, in load, over a few months. Like, so you're going to do that again. You're going to go from 40 to 80, like in the next, it's just an impossible model to work with. And I find when I really listen to people, like a lot of the models just aren't good models.
Yeah. You mentioned 3DMJ earlier, and it's funny because last week and a couple days ago, just through DMs and stuff, I was talking to Alberto Nunez a little bit about this. And one of the things that came up in conversation was just the environmental factor that you touched on. And one of the things that he was saying was because he works with a lot of people online, I believe, and just their group does as a whole. And he was saying that he noticed that the people that have a home gym lift very differently from the people that lift in commercial gyms. And of course there are confounders there in terms of like the kind of person that, is willing to invest in a home gym versus the person who's going to Planet Fitness. But overall, it was just interesting because I hadn't thought about that before, just in terms of the physical location, like other people looking at you doing, and something like a dumbbell lateral raise is something that like, jack dudes don't want to, or people, no, it's not really jack dudes, right? It's more like people who want to be jacked, but don't feel like they are jacked. They want to be lifting the heavy weights and not the 15s, because they think that it says something about their themselves as a person. So I thought that was something that I hadn't thought about, just in terms of the environment, and then within the environment, all the factors that are specific to that environment that are distinct from other places. And that was one of the things that, on my Japan trip, I was also kind of floored by, was just how different the environment was and how different the gyms felt, because even though it was technically like a commercialized, the location that I was going to around Japan, it was just like there was just no fuckery like anywhere. And which isn't to say that there weren't people doing stupid things, but more so just that like there's no super loud screaming. I didn't observe anyone who looked like they were lifting more than they could lift. So it was very different. And that was very interesting timing, just having that conversation with Berto, and then also seeing that sort of setting in Japan, and then how it differed from just anywhere really I've ever been in the United States. Quite different.
Did he get more specific on like what were the differences he saw in people?
He said that he has generally observed that people who lived in home gyms lift with better technique, and that people who lift in commercial gyms tend to try to progress way too fast.
I mean, definitely my instinct on that one is just like the bias of who has a home gym.
Yeah.
Or strongly about the
And
bias thing, because that's such a big, investment, to do that. I mean, sometimes like I guess like, you could live in the burbs, like just throw a squat rack in the basement. So that certainly does not explain all of it. And there definitely is like a psychological type that, doesn't mind like training on their own, and is maybe doing it with a little bit different of a internal goal.
Yeah. And I think that, like he originally had made this as like a post, which is kind of like how which is why it was more generalized. And then I kind of individually was talking to him about that. But I think that one of the things that he said in response to, because I made that comment to him of just like the kind of person that invests in a home gym, and he was like, yeah, totally agree with that and see that point. But I think his overall message was to say like, was just to really provoke the thought of, if you were lifting and no one was watching, how would you be lifting? Which, if you're someone who starts out their first time lifting in a commercial gym, which is most people that I know, is their first time lifting is like they walk into this cheap commercial gym, they never likely are forced to encounter that thought of like, well, how would I be lifting if no one else was around? And that's something that is a force regardless of whether you're paying attention to it or not. Anyway, closing up here, I think it would be good just to maybe each of us give a recommendation for, because a lot of the stuff we talked about, I think, especially in terms of just the progression and the rep stuff, it's like, I think a lot of the time I definitely take for granted just how much experience I've gained in such a short period of time. And I oftentimes forget the things that I was thinking about 5 years ago, and just how many of these concepts I wasn't just even aware of to begin with. And something that I think in my introduction to just programming and programming for clients, that was especially just hugely helpful, is Eric Helms's book on programming. So just to maybe give a concrete recommendation to trainers who are, in their first year of coaching, or people who are aspiring trainers, that is a book, the Muscle and Strength Pyramid book, that I would definitely recommend. I still think, even though the research over time is likely to be something that changes or shifts in a general direction, it's a very principle-based book, and it gives very practical recommendations as to where you might want to start if you're a beginner. And Eric does a really, really good job of articulating it simply and in a way that is very practically useful. So if you have any recommendations, Ethan, for people that are kind of in that extreme beginner stage, and they're just kind of like looking for resources to get into, what are the kinds of resources maybe that come up first for you in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the 3DMJ thing came out of like, our conversations several years ago. So I definitely agree with that. Eric's, a tremendous resource. In regards to complete beginners, huh? Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a pretty solid recommendation. Like, my head's kind of more spinning with like what we were talking about from the standpoint of the unique model of just like doing perfect reps and, not necessarily having a goal to get to. But, like I think that's an interesting talking point. I think it's something that like a lot of people have never thought to do with their training. At least not, plenty of people do just like, train to failure for sure. But in terms of like not having any, attachment to what you did previously, I think is really valuable. But, in terms of, connecting this to the question that you asked, I don't necessarily think that's like the best way for, a start beginner to train. I don't think they really have a good idea of necessarily like where failure is, or like how to, keep good position as they, fatigue and approach failure. So a lot of it's just going to come down to like, learning two basic things, right? Like it's like the people who kind of always oppose you are like, oh, just like get in the gym and learn to, be a man, like train, just, the other side of the coin is just like, the training hard thing, can come with time. And like in the beginning, you don't need so much effort and so much volume. You should just do things, really well, and then add effort over time. So, because I don't have a better answer than, in terms of a book recommendation that immediately comes to mind, I'm kind of like going off on this tangent and just letting words come out of my mouth, like as I think about it.
Yeah, that's
But
great.
the answer, to me is like in a theoretical world, like I always just hear, yeah, with beginner clients, like if you're a trainer, you should just like teach them how to, do things perfectly. And then, with time will come effort, with time will come volume. But I think in the real world, the thing that drives, behavior in this realm is just like it's excitement, and when you're excited about something and you're passionate about something, you do stupid things. And that's not the goal, is not to do stupid things, but without the excitement, you have nothing. Like someone's dad in the gym the other day asked me, like, my kid is in high school, he's 15 years old. Who he just told me my son wants to put on 15 pounds, for baseball. And I said, how old is your son? How tall is your son? How much does he weigh? Okay, my son's, 15 years old. He's, 6'1", and he's, 155 pounds. And he had asked someone else, first. And then when I walked up, they were like, oh, you should ask Ethan or whatever. And I think the answer before was like, well, 3,500 calories like equals, 1 pound of weight. And if you do, and I'm like, if your son is excited about this and he wants to do this, like there are a million teenage boys every year that put on 15 pounds, like, over 6 months. The key is for your son to be in the right environment. Like the knowledge is so obvious, like just be more full. Like, you watch like Sam Sulek, drink like, he drank like 1.5 gallons of Coke and like a box of Krispy Kreme donuts. And like, I don't think that's, a great idea, but like, it just shows that if a person with very, limited knowledge, like wants to gain weight, it's not complicated. Like tons of, fat motherfuckers do that every day, like by accident. So like, it's something that like the majority of Americans accomplish completely by accident. So if you're 6'1" and 155 pound, person going through puberty, like it's pretty easy to do that by accident. And if that doesn't happen, you're probably just not that excited about it. So I do think like you're not just going to have, the optimal trainer on day one that can just teach you how to do perfect form and teach you, the proper, amount of effort to give and everything. Like you're just not going to be perfect. But if you're excited, when you run into problems, you'll find ways to solve them. And I think that's what's really important. Like if under the beginning you're under, the premise that like adding load to the bar is progression, it is progression, and that's just fine. And hopefully you're resilient enough to make progress with that for a long time. But when you're not, you'll solve it if you're excited about it. You'll find the people to solve the problem that you have. Is the problem that you have that you need a better program from sets, and rep standpoint? Is the problem that you have you need a better exercise selection? Whatever that problem is, like if you're passionate about it, you'll solve it when you get there. And there's just so many resources at this time that I think like for the beginner, it's more about how to, find a place and people that cultivate, a level of excitement. And I think it's searching that out. Like that would be, my recommendation is just like, focus on creating an environment for yourself that, pulls that out of you. Being around, people that, are like-minded in that sense. And in this day and age, even if you can't find those people, you can watch them online, right? Like you can watch YouTube videos of people, that are training really hard, and that might be enough. But it's just like, move forward with, what you're excited about, find people that share that common excitement, and you guys will solve those problems as they come.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Sam Sulek, and it's funny that he comes up in this conversation because the comments that I see most on his videos are basically comments that are akin to Sam, I was I was in a total rut, in terms of lifting, and since I started watching your videos, like I'm just so excited to lift. I see your videos and I know what I'm doing the next day. You can say whatever you want about the way he trains or what he recommends or whether it's good for most people, blah, blah, blah. But I think, as you're saying, that key component with him, and I think that's why he's become so popular, is because he's doing that for so many kids who probably like don't have any friends to lift with. Maybe they're in that place of like they don't have a reason to be excited or to get motivated to do it. So I think he's doing a net good in that sense, at least. And the last comment that I wanted to make on that is in terms of the beginner, intermediate, advanced thing, is some people, in terms of their different characteristics, fall on different points in that spectrum. So someone can look very advanced from a muscular perspective and actually have many beginner qualities that put them in a different category depending on what aspect of their training and what aspect of their approach you're looking at. So some people, for example, have been training for 20 years and they look awesome and they don't do any sets to failure, or they've been training for 10 years and they look pretty good, but then they focus a little more on exercise selection and all of a sudden it's like their quads blow up like they haven't before. So I think that's also something to keep in mind, is just in terms of the self-appraisal, like being honest with each individual aspect of your training approach, because you may be fairly advanced in one area and you may be a total beginner in another. And it's important that you don't conflate those different aspects of, your approach as a whole and as an individual. All right, cool. Well, I don't know who we have next week, but we'll see, I guess. To be continued.